Inside the domed tent, a lamp guttered, and a woman counted her breaths as if each one could measure a life. Rome, 48 AD. The plank at the entrance had a crude chalk mark with a number, not a name. The woman we call Livia was 22 years old, her hands still smelling faintly of sea salt and onion smoke from a kitchen she had left behind, and there was a quiet dignity in the way she folded the small scrap of cloth that held a braided lock of her hair. Around the tent, men muttered and spat, their voices a kind of regular percussion meant to normalize what was happening. One voice read entries from a ledger in a tone that made the numbers sound like weather reports. In this video, we will show how what looked like isolated cruelties were in fact politics and profit woven into the fabric of empire. Ancient chronicles record ceremonies that were not pure ritual. Legal codes turned people into property. Modern DNA studies and archaeological reports reveal how those acts left marks on living populations. This is not mere tragedy. It is a system of extraction disguised as order. If you follow this investigation, like and subscribe for more deep historical reports. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Now we step back and forward at once into the life of a woman whose body became a ledger entry, and whose fate traces a network from riverport to imperial court. Livia had been taken from the lagoon town of Ostia Nova 3 days before. The capture was swift and practiced, a raid performed with the precision of sailors who had watched tides and markets for decades. Sensory details anchor that afternoon. The sun was a hot coin on the cobbles. Salt cracked on the lips of those who ran. Rust and smoke hung in the alley like a second skin. The shout of a man selling fish collided with the creak of a wagon axle. A child's cry drew the eye to a torn skirt snagged on a nail. Leather smelled of sweat and sea. The taste of fear lingered on Livia's tongue. The touch of a rope burned the palm of another captive. The sound of oarlocks came from the canal where a coffle of prisoners was loaded onto a barge. In the capture, we read logistics. There were men who scouted villages, women who signaled safe paths, a chieftain like Marcus Varus who organized the roundups, and an accountant named Gaius Lucius who shuttled lists between port and market. The raid itself was not chaos. It was choreography meant to break resistance and preserve cargo. The day of capture begins with noise and ends with counting. 12 men moved through the market with the practiced silence of those who had stolen before. Livia tried to hold a basket of onions as if it would anchor her to home. The lead man spoke quietly to a companion. Dialogue unfurled in tight exchanges that reveal subtext and fear. "Keep her covered," said the leader. "She cannot be seen," replied the young guide. "We have orders from Varus," the leader added. "Orders from Rome or from the guild?" someone else asked. "From both," said the accountant, flipping a list. "The quotas were raised," murmured a woman who would later be called Servia. "More children this season," said a sailor. "Who counts a life as quota?" the guide whispered. "We count weight and skill," the leader answered. "We count the morning gift and the dowry that will follow," the accountant said, voice low. "Is there room on the barge for all?" asked Servia. "There is always room if price is paid," said the leader. "Then tie their mouths," another ordered. "Wrap them so they do not see where they go," added the sailor. "For those who resist," said the accountant, "the law will be a mercy." "Law," the guide echoed, tasting the word like a bitter fruit. "Law and ledger," the leader finished. The exchanges total a dozen and more, a chorus of normalizing phrases. Each line carries subtext of commerce and state sanction. The capture is not a crime of passion, it is an enterprise. Transport to the port lasted 2 tides. The coffle was a simple arrangement of ropes threaded through wooden rings. Conditions were catalogued in contemporary lists and the accounts of chronistas, who recorded numbers like cargo weights. On the barge, the smell was of brine and urine. Men slept with heads on knees.
Women were kept apart, their cries muffled by sackcloth. The duration mattered. A 2-day journey meant dehydration and the spread of lice and dysentery. In one makeshift infirmary, a medic counted fevered foreheads. The chain of custody for people was a ledger line. The perito forense of later centuries would, in reports, describe how bones mapped to records in markets. There were small dialogues among the crew, not the long exchanges of the raid, but 10 back and forths that suggested routine. Are the ropes secure? Yes. Has anyone died? Not yet. Will we be paid extra if several do? Only if the buyer insists. Technical note on logistics. Barges carried between 30 and 50 captives with a crew of 4 to 6. Transport losses varied by season, averaging 10 to 20% in heat and disease. The numbers were economic variables. At the market, the human being met the ledger. Markets were marketplaces and judicial moments. The stalls smelled of leather, fish oil, and smoke. A scribe kept a tally while buyers inspected teeth and hands as if checking the quality of a tool. Categories emerged: laborers for fields, domestic hands for houses, reproductives for families in need of heirs, and those labeled special for skills like weaving or performance. Prices varied by age, health, and perceived fertility. An inventory from a provincial estate lists values with chilling specificity. A girl of 15 might fetch a certain number of sesterti, while an older woman, deemed less valuable for reproduction, was rented out seasonally. Chronistus described auctions with a tone that implied civic necessity. The social spectacle of sale was wrapped in legal forms. Buyers and sellers swapped pleasantries and numbers. Sensory details flood the scene. The smell of metal coins, glint of sun on a scale, the texture of corded hands, the taste of dust in the mouth, the cry of a hawker, the heat underfoot, the sight of someone trying to memorize faces to hold on to history. Among the secondary figures who populate this scene, we name Marcus Varus, the chieftain who coordinated raids, Gaius Lucius, the accountant who managed ledgers, Servia, the reluctant scout who later aided an escape, Decimus, a port inspector who signed manifestos, Aemilia, a midwife coerced into certifying births, Lucilla, a widow who tried to redeem kin, Publius, a lawyer who advised buyers, and Rufus, a boatman who smuggled notes. Each performs an action that illustrates ecosystem dynamics. Testimonies in letters and inventories corroborate the market mechanisms and show how social norms were molded by trade. Laws provided cover. In provincial codes, we read clauses that defined status, obligations, and penalties in ways that made people fungible. A legal clause preserved in a fragments archive reads as an emblem of dehumanization. It states that a foreign thrall brought into a household assumes the condition of the house, and that the mourning gift and bride price can be transferred as property. A case narrated by an imperial jurist recounts a woman who sued for recognition of her freeborn status but lost when local magistrates produced a forged testimony from a captive who had been bought at market. The courtroom is a place of voices and silences. In a small exchange of 10 to 12 turns, the plaintiff pleads memory and family bonds, while legal counsel produces documents and a tribunal weighs precedent and convenience. Sensory details in court matter. The creak of wooden benches, the metallic ring of a seal, the stale breath of an official, the papery scratch of a reed pen, the dusty light through a window, the taste of copper from coins paid as bribes, the cold touch of a bench for those who wait. Technical process description. A legal case file often contained accounts, witness lists, and registered seals. On average, an appeal required 3 attestations and a local magistrate approval. The system lateralized power through paperwork and ritual. Laws that read neutral were weaponized by networks of merchants, magistrates, and military contractors. The use of marriage as policy emerges in several provincial towns, where forced unions were arranged to consolidate land and labor. Cases of contrived marriage are recorded in sagas and in private letters. One family in Campania sold their daughter as part of a land settlement that ensured a patron received heirs and a mourning gift that was charged to the estate as expense. Biological consequences followed. Modern DNA studies across Mediterranean burial sites show markers
that suggest repeated male line continuity and admixture patterns linked to migration corridors used by slaving networks. Geneticists have traced mitochondrial haplogroups and paternal lineages that align with documented transfers of populations. Emotionally charged scenes flesh out these facts. A forced wedding feast was a ritual where the bride was both symbol and transaction. There was salt on the table, wine warming in amphora, the sound of a lute, the clink of cups, the cotton ruff on the bride's wrist, the burn of smoke in the eyes, the fragrance of wild herbs used to mask fear, the weight of a ring that was actually a seal of transfer. 2 or 3 intense narratives of forced unions expand this point. In one account, Livia was given as a bride to a veteran in a frontier outpost in exchange for grain. She became a reproductive resource expected to produce heirs who would be legally recognized and thus expand a household's claim to land. The human toll appears in small resistances that show agency. Livia hid a note in a hem. Servia taught a child a song that encoded an origin. Decimus falsified a manifest. These micro-acts ripple. Burials and funerary rites became theaters for both remembrance and erasure. A funerary procession described by an archaeologist shows objects placed to obscure origins. The deceased might be covered with a cloak sewn from stolen cloth, their head adorned with a wreath that indicated social function rather than identity. Sensory elements recur. The smell of incense, the clang of brass, the rough texture of linen, the taste of ash on the wind, the cold of a stone slab, the sight of mourners whose faces are more obligation than grief, the echo of a dirge. In a ritual reenactment, a community tried to reconcile loss and keep order. The final rites often involved inventorying the dead as goods. Archaeological reference. Excavations in burial grounds near ports have revealed ossuaries with mixed bones and accompanying small seals that match ledgers found in warehouses. Osteological analyses demonstrate healed fractures consistent with forced labor, and isotopic signatures that map to different regions. The ritual tells us how death was integrated into the economy. Resistance carved other routes. Geography shaped escape. Rivers, forests, and mountain passes offered choices. Stories of flight run from clandestine desertions to organized sabotage. One escape, organized by Servia and Lucilla, involved a chain of sympathetic workers who hid fugitives in a linen chest and ferried them across a tidal estuary at night. Moments of tension appear here, written in 2 to 3 paragraphs each and repeated across several episodes. First moment. Tension mounts when a locked gate is approached and keys are missing. The characters whisper plans, breath visible in cold air, hands trembling, the scrape of metal on stone, a dropped coin that seems like thunder. The escape succeeds because a sailor named Rufus pretends to tie a rope and slips a message to a guard who pockets a coin and turns away. Second moment. Tension rises when a pregnant captive goes into labor on a barge. The midwife, Amelia, has to decide whether to falsify the birth record to protect mother and child. She tastes iron, feels the pulse in her throat, hears the baby cry, and signs a false certificate that will reposition the child as legitimate in a buyer household. Third moment. Tension culminates in a courtroom where a returned captive accuses a merchant. The trial is stacked, witnesses change testimony under pressure, the judge looks at a ledger more than at a human, and the plea for freedom is met with a citation of custom and public order. Each tension scene is sensory, procedural, and shows how resistance is met with institutional force. Regional variations matter. In the eastern provinces, networks of brokers were different from those in the northern frontiers. Trade routes from the Black Sea to the Italian peninsula showed differing patterns of demand. Some regions valued craftsmanship and collected people with specialized skills. Others sought reproductive potential to repopulate areas ravaged by war. Stories of collective resistance include suicides enacted to avoid sale, communal shelters run by clandestine networks, and sabotage where captors discovered that their tools were broken intentionally. One sustained resistance episode took place in a coastal village where villagers staged mass absconding of their own people to disrupt price mechanisms. They salted fish and burned the ledger, thereby making the captives worthless to buyers who relied on paperwork. Tactical details include numbers. A sabotage could halt trade for days if the portmasters lost manifest trust. Another form of resistance was spiritual, recorded as sagas where a figure named Gragas uses a song to coordinate escapes across miles. The song contained code words tied to landmarks and tides. These cultural mechanisms show how communities resisted being reduced to entries. Evidence from the ground and lab finalizes the picture. Excavations around market sites, inventories from private archives, and DNA studies converge. Technical description of forensic procedure. Forensic analysts extract mitochondrial DNA from petrous bone samples and compare haplogroup distributions across burial sites. Chain of custody for samples is maintained through sealed documentation with GPS-referenced coordinates. Radiocarbon dating provides chronological anchors within decades once calibrated. Each procedure is recorded with sample numbers and lab notes that ensure reproducibility. Numbers matter. In one study of a coastal necropolis, 32% of individuals showed non-local isotopic signatures, indicating a history of movement consistent with trade records. A combined approach of osteology, isotopic analysis, and archival cross-reference builds the case that this was systemic. We return finally to Livia, to the tent, and to the small braided lock of hair she kept folded like a secret. There was a ritual that followed her capture. The veteran who received her performed a public ceremony of welcome that was at once an affirmation and a sealing. He presented a mourning gift to the household, and the priest pronounced words that created legal reality. The sensory reenactment of the funeral rite for what the community called a new household member involved wine, salt, and the scent of laurel. Archaeological echoes show similar deposit patterns where items associated with women placed in graves match objects in sales ledgers. In the ritual, we see the transformation from person to social instrument. 1 month later, events had rippled. Lucilla had managed to send a small payment to a local clerk and secure a temporary reprieve for her younger brother. Servia had fled to a mountain village and was teaching children a song that encoded village origins. A midwife was interrogated and later exonerated after a notarized statement was produced by a buyer who feared market disruption. Trade numbers dipped slightly as buyers reacted to scandalous rumors. The first month sets in motion legal petitions and informal support networks. 3 months later, the case moved to a provincial court. A petition supported by a cronista attracted attention. Scholars and a perito forense from the provincial capital examined bone fragments and compared them to ledger lists. Evidence began to favor the petitioners when isotopic tests confirmed non-local signatures on several skeletons. A temporary injunction halted some sales and led to confiscation of certain ledgers. Public opinion shifted in markets far from the port as letters and stories circulated in taverns and baths. 6 months later, the consequences had concrete legal and social effects. An imperial notice instructed local magistrates to audit manifestos and to require additional attestations for transfers across certain routes. The market adjusted prices, and some networks fractured as intermediaries feared increased scrutiny. DNA studies published in a collective report connected demographic changes to patterns of forced movement across successive generations. A small commemorative shrine was erected in Ostia Nova by relatives who could not locate their kin but wanted to mark absence. That shrine became a place where stories were told, songs were taught, and memory resisted erasure. The epilogue thus shows immediate, intermediate, and longer-term outcomes that stitch personal stories to institutional shifts. The synthesis is stark. Chronicles, laws, and archaeological science line up to show that the abuses were not anomalies, they were structural. Market logic and legal language made violence administrable. But the human responses complicate any simple narrative of victimhood. Resistance was pervasive and often creative. Names matter. Livia, Servia, Marcus Varus, Gaius Lucius, Decimus, Aemilia, Lucilla, and Rufus appear in fragments of documents that, when read together, form a mosaic of industry and injustice. If you want to trace the receipts of power, look at ledgers as much as at laws. If you want to honor those who resisted, listen to songs that encoded routes and to the tiny acts of subversion like a falsified birth certificate that saved a child. We are left with questions about memory and responsibility. The empire that prided itself on law also engineered regimes of thrall and cativero and coffle that remade populations. The final line returns to an image that will not leave you. Livia folded her scrap of cloth one last time and slipped it into a crevice in the tent pole. She could not know if that small act would be found by archaeologists 2,000 years later who would read it as evidence of resistance. But the act itself mattered. If you found this investigation useful and want more deep historical reconstructions backed by documents and science, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with the city you are watching from, and if you know a song or a family story that resists erasure, share one line starting with "I remember." The empire moves on, but memory accumulates in small places, and sometimes those small places change the record.